My name is Ray Kessler, and I'm 58 years old. Last spring, my wife loaded our two kids into her SUV on a Friday afternoon and drove them 3 hours north to spend the weekend at her boyfriend's lake house. She didn't call it that, of course. She told our 10-year-old they were going to see Mr. Halloway's place on the water. She told our 15-year-old to pack a swimsuit. She told me, standing in the kitchen with her sunglasses already on top of her head, that I wouldn't be comfortable there anyway. Then she smiled, the way you smile at a man you've already decided is furniture, and she left. Here's the part she didn't know. Here's the part her boyfriend definitely didn't know. That lake house they were driving to, the one he'd been calling his family's place for 6 months, the one he'd been renting on weekends to look like a big man in front of my wife, was built on land my father left me. My name was the only name on the deed. And by Sunday afternoon, I'd driven up there myself, let myself in with the key that had lived on my keyring for 30 years, and sat down at the kitchen table I built with my own 2 hands to ask one quiet question that ended 3 lives as they knew them. If you've ever been the man everyone underestimated, the one who let people talk because you had nothing to prove, this story is for you. Stick around to the end, because the way this landed is not the way anyone at that table expected. Do me a favor and hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now let me back all the way up, because to understand the weekend, you have to understand the 30 years that built it. I need to tell you who I was, because the version of me my wife married is the version she stopped seeing somewhere around year 15. I grew up in a town most people can't find on a map, the kind of place with 1 stoplight and a diner that closes at 2. My father, Walt Kessler, fixed furnaces. That's it. That's what he did. He'd come home smelling like cut metal and cold basements, and he'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, and he'd tell me the same thing about 100 different ways. A man doesn't announce what he owns, son. He just holds the key. I didn't understand it when I was 12. I understand it now. I started my own company when I was 26. Kessler Mechanical, commercial heating, cooling, and refrigeration. I started it out of the bed of a truck with a set of my father's old tools and a phone number I answered myself. The first year I made almost nothing. The second year I hired 1 guy. By the time I met Lynn, I had 11 employees and a shop with my name on the sign, and I was doing well enough that I never had to think about the price of anything. But I'll tell you what, I drove to our first date, a 2009 pickup with 200,000 miles and a dent in the tailgate I never bothered to fix. I still drive it. I could buy any truck I want. I drive that one because my father told me that money you show is money you're inviting other people to take, and I have never once been proven wrong about that. Lynn was 30 when we met. She was sharp and funny, and she laughed at things nobody else thought were funny, which is the thing that got me. We got married a year later. We had Ethan 4 years after that, and Maddie 5 years after him. For a long time, we were good. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story about a woman who was always rotten. She wasn't. There were years I would have driven that old truck off a bridge for her. But somewhere in the middle, something changed, and I was slow to see it because I was busy being the man who paid for everything without being asked. Here's a thing about me you should know. I never told Lynn exactly how much the business was worth. Not because I was hiding it, but because it never came up in a way that mattered, and because my father's voice was always in my ear. She knew we were comfortable. She knew the mortgage was paid off. She knew when she wanted a new kitchen, she got a new kitchen, and when she wanted to fly to see her sister in Arizona, she flew first class and I never blinked. What she didn't know was the shape of the whole thing. She didn't know about the buildings I owned that the company leased back from me. She didn't know the business was structured so tight a lawyer could bounce a quarter off it. She didn't know because she never asked, and I never volunteered, and that gap between what she assumed and what was true is the entire hinge this whole story turns on. Now let me tell you about the lake house, because it's the star of this whole thing, and she treated it like a joke for a decade. My father bought 40 acres on Cedar Lake back in 1971 for almost nothing. Nobody wanted it then. It was too far north, too much mosquito, too much work. There was a hunting shack on it that leaned like a drunk. When Dad passed, he left that land to me, and only me, and he left it inside a trust he'd set up so it could never be split, sold out from under me, or dragged into anybody's fight. The Kessler Family Trust. I'm the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. The deed to that land and everything on it reads one name, and it isn't Lynn's, and it never was, and by law it never could have been unless I personally handed it over, which I never did. For 15 years, I drove up to Cedar Lake almost every weekend I could steal, and I tore that leaning shack down board by board, and I built a house. Not a cabin, a house. Cedar siding I milled from trees on the property. A stone fireplace I laid one rock at a time over the course of 2 summers. A kitchen with a long table I built out of a single white oak that came down in a storm. I wired it myself. I plumbed it myself. There is not 1 square foot of that place that didn't pass through my hands. It took me the better part of my 40s, and every nail in it is mine. You know what Lynn called it? The money pit. The shack. Ray's little hobby up north. She came up maybe a dozen times in 15 years, always complained about the drive, always found a reason to leave early. By the time it was finished, a genuinely beautiful house on a quiet lake, she'd decided it was beneath her, and she stopped going entirely. She'd say it to her friends like a punchline. Ray disappears up to his shack. I let him have it. Every man needs a shed. I stopped inviting her. I'd go up alone or take the kids, and honestly, some of the best weekends of my life were up there with Ethan learning to fish off the dock and Maddie asleep in front of that fireplace. Lynn missed all of it. She missed it on purpose. About 4 years ago, I made a decision that I want you to remember, because it comes back around. The property taxes on lakefront land aren't small, and it felt foolish to have a house that beautiful sitting empty most of the year. So I set it up as a weekend rental through a management company out of the county seat, a small outfit called North Shore Property. A woman named Peg ran the bookings. It brought in enough to cover the taxes and upkeep with a little left over, and it meant the place was cared for instead of moldering. I kept a couple of weekends a month blocked out for myself and the kids, and the rest of the year it went to strangers. Fishermen, families, couples wanting a quiet getaway. I never met any of them. Peg handled it all. Lynn barely registered that I'd done it. To her, it was just more of Ray fussing over the shack. She had no idea what that house actually was, and she was about to find out in the worst possible way. Now, let me tell you how Lynn changed, because the man watching this who's been where I've been already feels it coming. It started small the way these things do. About 2 years ago, she got a new circle of friends, women from a club she joined, the kind of women whose husbands were always described by their job titles. Suddenly, our life wasn't enough. The paid-off house wasn't enough. The trips weren't enough. She started making little comments. I'd come home from a job in my work clothes, and she'd wrinkle her nose and say, "You could at least change in the truck before you come in the house." I'd pack my own lunch for the shop like I have for 30 years, and she'd say, "You know, we can afford for you to eat like a person, right?" She started introducing me at parties as, "My husband, he's an HVAC," in a tone that made it sound like an apology. I let it go. That was my mistake, and I'll own it. I let it go because I loved her, and because I figured it was a phase, and because a man who's secure doesn't need to defend himself over a lunch pail. But letting it go taught her that she could say anything and I'd absorb it. I trained her the same way I'd trained her to think that money would always appear when she wanted it, without her ever having to understand where it came from. I made myself small and quiet and dependable, and she started to mistake quiet for weak. Those are not the same thing. She was about to learn the difference. The comments got sharper. She started comparing me, out loud, to other men. Sandra's husband just took her to Turks and Caicos. Spur of the moment. Just decided one morning, "Well, Lynn, I've offered to take you anywhere in the world 4 times this year, and you said you were too busy." She'd wave that off. It wasn't about the trip. It was never about the trip. It was that other men performed their wealth, and I refused to, and she decided that a man who wouldn't perform must not have anything worth performing. Then Brent Holloway showed up, and everything I'd been slow to see got very, very clear. I first heard the name at a dinner party, Brent this, Brent that, Brent's a developer, Brent's putting up condos by the river, Brent drives a Range Rover, Brent has a place on the water. She said his name the way you say a name you've been practicing in the mirror. I'm 58 years old, and I've been reading people across negotiating tables my whole career, and I knew, the first time I heard her say Brent Holloway, exactly what I was dealing with. I didn't say a word. My father's voice again. Don't announce it. Hold the key. I want to be clear that I didn't fly off the handle. I didn't accuse her. I didn't check her phone in the night like some men would. I did what I've always done when something's wrong with a system I built. I started paying attention, and I started keeping track, quietly, the way I'd keep track of a job that wasn't adding up. Here's what I noticed over about 3 months. Lynn started having girls' weekends that hadn't existed before. She'd leave Friday and come back Sunday and be vague about where. She got a second phone, a cheap one that she kept in her purse and thought I never saw. She started dressing differently, younger, on days she said she was just running errands. She'd take calls in the garage. She stopped wearing her ring on the weekends and told me it was getting resized. It wasn't getting resized. I found it in her jewelry box, exactly where it always was every single one of those weekends. None of that is what broke it open, though. What broke it open was Cedar Lake. One Thursday, I called Peg at North Shore to block out a weekend for me and Ethan. Father-son thing, we were going to work on the dock. And Peg, who's a lovely older woman with no idea about any of my personal life, said, "Oh, Ray, that weekend's taken, hun. Your renter's got it." Real nice fella. Been booking it steady for a few months now. Books the whole place. Always pays cash up front. Always the same weekends. And something cold went down the back of my neck because a man booking the same lakefront house every few weeks, paying cash, always the same weekends, is not a fisherman. So I asked her, real casual, "Remind me of his name? I like to know who's using the place." And Peg said, "Halloway. Brent Halloway. Charming guy." I sat in my truck in the shop parking lot for a long time after that call. Not angry. Something colder than angry. Do you understand what I'd just learned? My wife's boyfriend had been renting my house. My house. The one I built with my hands. The one on my father's land. The one my name is on. He'd found it on a rental site, booked it, and had been bringing my wife there on weekends and telling her it was his family's lake place. He'd been playing Lord of the Manor in my kitchen. He'd been lighting fires in the fireplace. I laid stone by stone and passing it off as his own to impress a woman who happened to be my wife, who happened to have no idea she was being cheated on inside the very house her husband built. You couldn't write it. But it's exactly what happened, and once I knew it, everything else clicked into place. The vague weekends. The second phone. Her sudden new opinion that some men know how to enjoy what they've earned. She thought she was trading up. She thought she'd found a real man with a real house on the water, a self-made developer, everything she'd decided I wasn't. And the whole thing, the entire fantasy she was building her exit on, was sitting on top of a lie she'd never bothered to check, inside a house that belonged to me. Now, here's where I want you to understand something about how I'm built, because a lot of men would have driven up there that night and kicked the door in. I thought about it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't sit in that truck and think about it, but my father didn't raise a man who kicks in his own door. He raised a man who owns the door. And I realized, sitting there, that I was holding a hand nobody at that table knew I was holding, and the worst thing I could do was play it too early out of anger. So I did nothing. For 3 more weeks, I did nothing. I went to work. I packed my lunch. I ate the little comments. I watched Lynn float through the house glowing with a secret she was sure I was too dull to notice. And I called a lawyer, a quiet one, the best in the state, and I brought him everything. The trust, the deed, the business structure, the buildings. The prenup Lynn signed 21 years ago that she'd forgotten existed. The one I'd asked for, not because I didn't trust her, but because my father, on his deathbed, made me promise to protect what he built. Lynn had laughed when she signed it. Like you're some millionaire, Ray. She signed it in the county clerk's office on a Tuesday and never thought about it again. I thought about it every day for 21 years. That's the difference between us in one sentence. My lawyer, a calm man named Gerald who'd seen everything twice, looked over the whole picture and set his coffee down and said, "Ray, in 30 years I have rarely seen a man this protected." I said, "I know." He said, "She has no idea, does she?" I said, "No." He said, "When do you want to do this?" And I said, "Let her make the next move. I want it to be hers." I didn't have to wait long, because Lynn got bold. That's the thing about people who mistake your quiet for weakness. They get careless. They start believing their own story about you. It was a Wednesday night. The kids were doing homework. Lynn came into the den where I was reading, and she had that look, the rehearsed look, and she said she was taking the kids up to Brent's lake house that weekend. Just like that, out loud, in our house. She said it would be good for them to see how the other half lives. She said Brent had a real place on the water, not like your shack. She said Ethan could water ski behind Brent's boat. She said Maddie would love the actual guest rooms. She stood there in my den and described my house to me, every room I built, as if it belonged to another man, a better man, and she told me I wasn't invited because I wouldn't fit in up there. I want to tell you what I felt, and it wasn't rage. It was almost peace, because she'd just handed me the whole thing, gift-wrapped. She was going to take my children to my house, introduce them to her boyfriend as the host, and let a con man play father in a home I built for them. And she was doing it in the open, daring me to be small about it, certain I'd just take it like I took everything else. I looked up from my book and I said, "That sounds nice. The kids will love the lake." And I watched something flicker across her face, disappointment almost, that I hadn't given her a fight to win. She wanted a scene. She wanted me to beg or rage so she could tell her friends how impossible I was being. I gave her nothing. I gave her a pleasant nod, and I went back to my book, and inside I was as calm as still water, because I already knew how the weekend ended. I'd known for 3 weeks. Friday afternoon, she loaded the kids up. I helped carry Maddie's bag out to the car, because whatever was happening between Lynn and me, that little girl was still my little girl, and I wasn't going to let one bad weekend start with her father sulking. I buckled her in. I told Ethan to keep an eye on his sister. I told them I loved them and to have fun on the water. And Lynn stood there by the driver's door with her sunglasses on top of her head and said, one more time, unable to help herself, "You really wouldn't be comfortable there, Ray." I said, "I'm sure you're right." And I meant something completely different than she heard, and she drove away. I let them have Friday. I let them have Saturday. And here's why, and it matters, because it's the whole difference between revenge and cruelty. Those were my kids up there. Whatever I was going to do, I was not going to do it in a way that scared them or made a scene in front of a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old. I wanted a full day for the con to run itself out, for Brent to get comfortable, for Lynn to settle into her fantasy, so that when it came apart clean and quiet and final, on my terms, at a moment I chose. Saturday night, I made a couple of calls. I called Gerald and told him it was time. I called Peg at North Shore, and I told her something I should have told her weeks earlier, that the renter had been using the place under false pretenses, and I'd be taking it back personally, and she was mortified and apologetic, and I told her none of it was her fault, because it wasn't. And then I got a good night's sleep, better than I'd slept in months. And Sunday morning, I got in my old truck with the dent in the tailgate, and I drove 3 hours north to my own house. I want to walk you through the last part slowly, because it happens slowly, and because every second of it is burned into me. I got to Cedar Lake a little after noon. I didn't screech up the drive. I parked my truck behind Brent's leased Range Rover, the one with the dealer plates, because he didn't even own that, I found out later. And I sat for a moment and looked at the house I built, sitting there, gold in the afternoon light with smoke coming out of my chimney. My chimney! Then I walked up to my own front door and I took out my key ring, the one with the worn leather fob my father gave me, and I put my key in my lock and I let myself in. The first thing I heard was Brent's voice, loud, the voice of a man performing. He was in the kitchen, my kitchen. He was telling some story about when we built this place, like he'd ever held a hammer in his life, and I heard Lynn laugh, her practiced laugh, and I heard Maddie ask if she could have more lemonade, and something in me went very quiet and very certain. I walked into my kitchen. Brent was standing at my oak table with a glass of wine, mid-story, gesturing at my fireplace. Lynn was sitting at the far end, relaxed, radiant, playing the woman of a house that wasn't hers, with a man who wasn't hers in a fantasy that was about to end. Ethan was on his phone at the counter, Maddie was coloring at the table, and every one of them looked up when I walked in, and for one long second, nobody said anything at all. Brent recovered first, because men like Brent always recover first. It's their whole skill. He straightened up and put on a face and said, "Hey, I'm sorry, this is private property. I don't know who you think you..." And I watched Lynn's face go white, because she knew exactly who I was, and she couldn't understand why I wasn't at home being furniture where she'd left me. I didn't raise my voice. I've never had to raise my voice to be heard. Not at a job site with 40 guys. Not across a negotiating table. Not once. I set my keys down on my table. next to my daughter's coloring book, and I said, "It's not private property to me, Brent. I own it." You could have heard the lake through the walls. Brent laughed, a nervous little laugh, and said, "Buddy, I've been renting this place for months. I think I'd know." And I said, "You've been renting it from a company called North Shore Property. They manage it for me. My father bought this land in 1971. I built this house with my hands. The deed's in a trust with exactly one name on it, and it's mine." I looked at Lynn then for the first time. "The shack?" I said. "Ray's little hobby up north? This one." I have never in my life seen a person's entire understanding of the world rearrange itself in real time the way Lynn's did in that kitchen. She looked at the fireplace like she was seeing it for the first time, because she was. She looked at the table her daughter was coloring on, and I watched her remember. All at once. 20 years of me disappearing north on weekends, 20 years of punchlines she'd told at my expense, and she understood that every single one of them had been about the very house she'd chosen to run to. The color went out of her face, and it did not come back. Brent tried to keep it going, because it was all he had. He said something about how there must be a mistake, how his guy handled the bookings, how he had a place just like this on another lake. And that's when I did the only sharp thing I did that whole day. I took out my phone, and I pulled up the deed, and the trust document, and the county property record with my name on it, and I set the phone on the table facing him, and I said, quietly, "Show me yours." He didn't have one. Of course he didn't, because Brent Halloway didn't own a lake house, or a Range Rover, or the condos by the river he'd been bragging about. I learned all of it later, and it was even smaller than I guessed. He was a mid-level guy at a development firm, not a developer, deep in debt, renting my house on cash. He didn't have to play a role for a woman. He was going to drop the second the money ran out or the wife found out. And yes, there was a wife in another town who I made sure found out too. But in that kitchen, all anyone needed to know was that when I said, "Show me yours," he had nothing. And everybody in that room watched him have nothing. Lynn stood up from the table. Her voice was shaking. Ray, I didn't know it was..." And she stopped, because there was no end to that sentence that helped her. "You didn't know it was my house? That's worse, Lynn. That means you'd have done all of this anyway. Some other man's house. And it's only an accident of the universe that the house you ran to was the one I built for our children." I didn't say that out loud. I looked at her, and I let the silence say it, and I watched her hear it. Then Brent, cornered, did the thing cornered small men do. He tried to make it about me. He puffed up and said, "You think a deed makes you a man? She came to me, pal. You ever ask yourself why?" And I'll be honest, that's the moment a younger man, or a smaller one, throws a punch. I've got 50 pounds and 30 years of physical work on Brent Halloway. I could have put him through the window I installed myself. But my kids were in the room. And more than that, I'd already won so completely that hitting him would have been like a man who owns the bank robbing the till. So I just looked at him, and I said, in the same flat voice, I'd say, a price to a vendor, "No, Brent, I never asked myself why. Because a man who has to rent another man's house to feel like somebody isn't a mystery to me, he's just sad." And I turned my back on him, which is the most disrespectful thing you can do to a man like that, and I crouched down next to my daughter. "Hey, Maddie Bug," I said, "you want to help your old man light a real fire in that fireplace? I built it, you know. Every rock." And she said, "You built it, Daddy?" Like it was the most amazing thing she'd ever heard. And she took my hand, and that was the moment I felt Lynn understand that she had lost something that had nothing to do with a house. Here's the mask slip, the moment that stays with me. Lynn followed me out to the truck an hour later, after I'd told the kids to get their bags, after Brent had already slunk out to his leased Range Rover and driven off without so much as looking at the woman he'd blown up a family for. Lynn came out to the truck, and the performance was gone. All of it. And for 1 second I saw the woman I married. She said, quietly, "I don't know when I turned into this." And I believed her. That's the terrible part. I believed her. There was a real person in there under 20 years of deciding I wasn't enough. And for 1 second she surfaced. And she was afraid. And she was ashamed. And I ached for her the way you ache for something you used to love. And then she ruined it. Because she couldn't help it. She said, "Ray, we can figure this out. The house, the business, whatever it's worth, we can. And there it was. Even now, even here, even standing in the gravel outside a house she'd just watched me reveal I built, her mind had already gone to the money. What's it worth? What can I get? And the ache stopped. Clean, like a valve closing, because I understood that the woman I'd loved wasn't coming back, and the woman standing in front of me had done the math on our marriage before she'd even finished apologizing for it. I put the kids' bags in the truck. I said, "Get in, guys, we'll grab burgers on the way home." And I looked at Lynn one last time in that gravel drive, and I said, "The only thing left to say, you spent 20 years telling everyone this was a shack. You were half right. Somebody was pretending in this house. It just wasn't me." And I drove my kids home in the old truck with the dent in the tailgate, and Maddie fell asleep against the window. And Ethan, 15 and quiet, said about an hour in, "Dad, did you really build that whole house?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "That's the coolest thing I've ever seen. And I'll tell you, that was worth more than the deed." Now let me tell you how it landed, because the aftermath is where people like Lynn and Brent really learn what they did. The divorce was not a fight, because there was nothing to fight over. Lynn walked into her lawyer's office expecting to walk out with half of a fortune she'd never bothered to understand, and she walked out with a very different number. The business was mine, established before the marriage, structured airtight, protected by a prenup she'd laughed at in a county office 2 decades earlier. The lake house was never marital property, it was trust property. My father's foresight reaching 30 years past his own death to protect his grandchildren. The buildings, the accounts she never knew existed, all of it sat behind walls I'd built as quietly and carefully as I'd built that fireplace. Here's the part I want you to hear, though, because it's the part that separates a man from a small man. I could have left her with the legal minimum. Gerald actually advised it. He said, "Ray, you owe her nothing here. And I mean nothing." And I thought about it. But those are my children's mother, and my children were going to live in her house half the time, and a boy learns how to be a man by watching how his father treats a woman who wronged him. So I gave her more than I had to. I made sure she had a good home and a fair income and never had to want for anything, not for her sake, but for Ethan's and Maddie's, and I told her that to her face. I said, "This isn't for you. It's so my kids never have to see their mother struggle. Don't ever mistake it for anything else." And she cried, and I let her, and I did not take it back, and I did not give her a single dollar more. Brent Halloway. Let me close the loop on Brent. It turned out the wife I mentioned in the next town over was very interested in how her husband had been spending his cash-only weekends. His job, the one where he was basically a developer, did not survive the story getting around because it's a small industry and men who lie about owning things they rent tend to have lied about other things too. And they had, last I heard, Brent was renting a 1-bedroom apartment and very much not on any lake. He got exactly what he built, which was nothing, standing on top of a lie in a house that was never his. One more thing and then I'll let you go. About 2 months after all of it, I got a call from Lynn's mother. Her mother, 79 years old, a woman I'd always liked and who'd always liked me, she called me and she said, "Raymond, I've known my daughter her whole life and I love her, and I have to tell you she was a fool, and you built something beautiful and she couldn't see it, and I'm sorry." That was the only apology I got from that whole family, and it came from the one person who had nothing to gain by giving it, which is the only kind of apology that's ever worth anything. I still go up to Cedar Lake most weekends. I took it off the rental market, obviously. Ethan comes when he's not busy being 17 now, and he's finally interested in learning how I wired the place, which tells me something's landing. Maddie has a favorite rock in the fireplace. She picked it out, bottom left, and she tells everyone her dad built the whole house, one rock at a time, and she's right. Lynn's never been back, and she never will, and that house is quiet, and it's mine, and every board in it knows exactly whose it is. Here's what 30 years in one lake house taught me. The loudest man in the room is almost never the richest one, and the man who has to tell you what he owns usually owns nothing at all. Real worth doesn't announce itself, it doesn't perform. It just sits there, quiet and paid for, holding the key, waiting for the day somebody underestimates it one time too many. My father told me that when I was 12 and I didn't understand it. I understand it now. A man doesn't announce what he owns. He just holds the key, and when the moment comes, he lets himself in. That's my story. 40 acres, one house, 30 years, and a woman who called it a shack right up until the day she found out whose name was on the deed. If you've ever been the quiet one people mistook for the weak one, do me a favor, hold your key, your day comes. Drop a comment and tell me about the time somebody underestimated you. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.